Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Q&A live session with the National Quilters Circle. My name is Leah. I'm your moderator today, and I'm going to officially introduce you to Colleen over there. You can see her right now. Hi, Colleen. But before I do it, I just have a couple reminders for you, especially if you're with us for the first time. So if you're with us live today, it is St. Patrick's Day. You can tell by our green, we're a little bit ready to go with that. But this is all about your questions, so you can get some answers for your quilting. That means that I want to draw your attention to the chat box. That's going to be below your video player, or you could use the chat on Facebook or YouTube, depending on where you're viewing from, and just drop in whatever quilting questions you have for Colleen here today. We get to as many questions as we have in the time that we have today, and it's always a really fun time. We love to know where you're watching from as well, so even if you don't have a question yet and you just want to say hello, let us know where you're viewing from and maybe a fun project that you've got going on in your quilting life right now, what you're working on, and we always like to crowdsource as well. I have a little promo for you as well, and I think Colleen is going to get to show us about it. This is, like I said, St. Patrick's Day, a shamrock star placement pattern, which I've practiced saying, and Colleen's going to feature that in just a moment here. That is enough from me, though. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Welcome, Colleen. Colleen, please give us a little introduction to yourself, what you've been up to lately, and then, of course, talk about that fantastic pattern you've got in front of you.
Okay. Thanks for having me today, Leah. National Quilt Circle, even if you're watching from around the world, let us know where you're from. My background is in home economics. I learned to sew from my mom and my grandmothers. All of us were sewers, but none of them were technically quilters. And so as I went through college thinking I was going to be a home ec teacher, and then thought, what was I thinking? Working with high school students the rest of my life? I didn't even have kids yet. So I kind of went off to the business side. I worked in retail and worked in the fabric world. And then I met a quilter and I was hooked. We took a class. I started making shop samples for a local quilt shop that had just opened in my area, started teaching some classes, and found out that adult learners are a lot of fun to work with. They have an attention span that lasts a lot longer than a teenager, mind you, because I raised 4 of them. So working with adults and working with quilters has become my passion. I worked for a leading quilt magazine for a number of years. Then I worked for another quilt shop and eventually landed here so that I can teach quilters and answer questions and do all kinds of fun projects that I dream of. So one of the things that I worked on recently was something for St. Patrick's Day, because my background is on heritage, has some Irish in it. About a 30%, I think, or 25% Irish background. After doing Ancestry, you find out your percentages. I decided to do something kind of fun with just that big sawtooth star and then do a little applique in the center. So as Leah said, one of our projects that we do small projects every other week on Facebook Live. And this was a free downloadable pattern so that you could, people who are just starting can have some fun, learn some techniques. If they want to attempt a little bit of applique, they could do that. But even if you're a seasoned quilter, we always loved having those small projects that we can kind of change out our environment. A lot of us have been home a lot, and kind of have something to mark time with the holidays kind of gives us a sense of a way to refresh our home environment a little bit, or even as a gift item. So Shamrock Star was created for St. Patrick's Day. I'm working on all kinds of other things. I had blocks I was going to show, and I left them in my upstairs studio today. But a little bit of spring is coming to Facebook Live soon. A little bit of a tulip display. So be looking forward to that. But I hope you all have questions that we can jump in and assist you in any of your I wonder if kind of questions.
We do have some questions in, but I always do like to say hello to some of the first people that share where they're viewing from at the top of the hour here. We've got Lisa that says happy St. Patrick's Day. Yay. Susan tuning in from Ontario, Canada. Kathy from North Carolina. Kathy's a first-time viewer, so welcome to Kathy. Yes. And everybody else that's joining for the first time as well. We've got Colleen for about an hour here. So we're going to get to the questions and get to, like I said, as many as we can get through. We're going to go and scroll up here. Grace has the first question that's in our box we're going to touch. And Grace wants to know if there is a simple formula to create a larger sized quilt from a smaller pattern. So for example, she finds herself loving a crib or a lap sized quilt pattern, but wants to make it into a twin. What would you suggest for that?
Okay, that's a really good question, because when I was working for the Quilt magazine, I was always thinking about, like, well, what if I just doubled, my measurements? Well, when you double measurements, you also double seam allowances. So that's a no-no. When you want to take something that's smaller scale, you have to work with the finished size of areas and kind of graph it out, draw it out. I know that's old school, but it is the best way for our brains to kind of get wrapped around the math, because as you graph it out, you're graphing the portion, say for instance, in this in this placemat, this center piece, you would deal with that measurement to just, as you put it on graph paper. But later, when you decide, okay, I'm going to cut that out, you also have to remember to add seam allowances to something. So multiplying things, people always say, well, if I took a crib and I multiplied it, the numbers, all the cutting, then you're also multiplying the seam allowances, and that's going to get you into trouble. So graphing it out is always the safest way to go, even if it's kind of a rough drawing, so that you have an idea. If you want to enlarge, remember, enlarge just the block, not the seam allowance. Sometimes taking a design, maybe from a baby quilt or even a tabletop, or if it's a larger one, making multiples of those. So instead of having one block like that, make 9, and so that you have 3 across and 3 down. But check your measurements again, because the width of something, because you like it, doesn't mean that it's going to multiply, like 3 of those is going to fit on a bed. Go and actually measure your bed, or go to our website and find some of the resources that we have that give you bed sizes and the drop that you want on a bed, so that you can create enough width and length to actually fit the surface that you're looking for. So you have to do a little bit of math. I hate to say that, because all of us are having flashbacks to 3rd grade and word problems because, they made us work those problems for a reason, so that we would logically think through. And I had a math teacher, even in high school, who would always say, write down what you know. You want the quilt to be this size, write that number down so you remember it and you see it. Now write down the size of the quilt that you're starting with. Write that down. Draw out those dimensions so you visually see it. A lot of us as quilters are very visual, so it will assist you in thinking through the process logically. And it can happen. Some patterns, if you actually purchase the pattern, on the reverse side will have the various sizes, from a crib quilt all the way maybe up to a queen. So sometimes designers will do that work for you. So seeing a pattern on the internet is one thing, but actually purchasing the pattern can give you the value of those extra sizes, where all of the math for yardages are figured out and all the cutting and quantities. It's actually worth it to purchase the pattern and support that designer. So take those things into consideration. If you want to be the quilter who does it themselves, write it down, draw it out, do the math, but remember your 1/4 inch seam allowances. And then if it's a pattern you've seen that's available, inquire and see that if it has multiple sizes available. It might be that designer's already done the work for you.
All right, let's move on to our next question. This is another first-time viewer, so welcome to all our first-timers. This one is Michelle. So Michelle is curious if you sell notions.
I do not. I don't work for any of the notion companies. Because I've been in the quilt world long enough, I have kind of accumulated a lot of notions. So if there is a specific one that you're curious about and say, I need to buy a rotary cutter, or I want to buy a seam ripper, I can kind of give you suggestions on what I like. Doesn't mean that everyone likes the exact same tool, but we used to do a lot of review of tools. So I have worked with a wide variety of different kinds of tools, but Nope, sadly, I do not work for any of the tool companies, and I don't sell any of them myself. So those quilt shops, those local shops in your area, if you have one, support them. They have struggled in the last couple of years, and most of them would love to see you walk in the door, or go online and see if they have an online web place that you can order from, maybe do curbside pickup if that's what you're comfortable with. But in the crowdsourcing here too, if you have a certain tool you're looking for or looking at purchasing, or say, since you're new into quilting, what rulers, should I buy? Which ones are the best? What do people tend to like? You're going to get a whole lot of suggestions from the quilters who view along here, because we all have our favorites and can give you help along the way. So if there's a certain tool you're looking for, I can help you in that area.
All right, I'll keep an eye out if there's any more questions about notions. We can talk a little more specifically like you just said. Before our next question, a couple more hellos. We've got Dawn tuning in from Washington and Ginger from Peoria, Illinois. Having a lucky day, says Shelly. Happy St. Patrick's Day from Washington State. So welcome to everybody that's joining us. We're just getting through all the questions we've got for Colleen here about quilting. And we're a couple in, but please drop yours into the chat box. We want to get to as many as we can. Now, our next question comes in from Angela. It looks like Angela might have been having some audio issues, so hopefully that's fixed by now. We're live now, and hopefully Angela can hear us. Angela's curious about lining up the fabric on the line of the ruler or beside the line. So could you speak a little bit to that?
That is a very good question. Positioning of rulers is always kind of the ticket to getting a good cut and a good size on your patchwork, so everything fits together. Now, on rulers, let's see if I can reach one that's really close by here, and something as a base for it. Now, the lines on our rulers are, and this is just an example, I probably own 5 different brands of rulers, but they're broken lines. They aren't continuous. So as we line up that notch, say we want to go to the half mark or even a 1/4 inch mark, we're going to be lining up the cut edge of our fabric, and that little line technically should reside on top of the fabric, but not poke out the opposite side. So let's see if I can come up with a piece of fabric to put in, and I know my camera will not pick it up well enough, but if I'm going to cut something, say I was just going to make a cut through this block, which I wouldn't because it's a good block, but you shouldn't see the fabric underneath go past the line that you want it to be at, and you shouldn't see the mat underneath between the fabric and the line you want it to be at. That line should reside right on top of the cut edge of your fabric. And it's hard to keep it there. Our rulers tend to glide a little bit, but accuracy in cutting and holding rulers just comes with doing it over and over. When I've taught beginners, I would take out a piece of fabric that I wonder why I ever bought, and I give it to the new quilter. I give them a rotary cutter and a ruler, and I tell them to make spaghetti. It's that practicing over and over of holding the ruler and getting the angle of your rotary cutter to be perpendicular to your surface so that you aren't going undercutting or outside cutting away from the edge of your ruler. So you want to be able to hold it at a comfortable angle, because wear on our shoulders and our wrists and everything is not fun to have happen either. But holding that comfortably and being able to push out and away from your body in a smooth motion takes just practice. It's motion memory. It's not much different than you being able to pick up a pencil, close your eyes, and write your signature. It's motion memory. Your hand knows where to go to make the letters in your signature. And that's kind of what we need to create in cutting also, is how to place your hand on that ruler, how to hold the rotary cutter for accuracy in cutting. But that cut edge of the fabric or the mark on our ruler should reside right on top of that cut edge of fabric as you cut. I hope that makes sense.
All right. Well, keep an eye out if there's any more details that any viewer really is looking for, but also if Angela has any further details in there. Another couple hellos here. We've got Lori from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I'd also like to point out that that shamrock pattern, our shamrock star placement pattern that Colleen's got in front of her, if you don't know where to find that, check the chat box. Our team has dropped in the link for that download so you can grab that pattern. We'd also love to know if you're tackling it. Let us know. What are your plans for that pattern? Where are you going to display it? What are you going to use it for? So we would love to hear from you on what you're up to with your quilting. We'll move to Alice's question next. And Alice is asking, when you're marking borders on a quilt, how do you decide how to handle the corners when you're hand quilting? And Alice is from Ontario, Canada.
I'm personally not a hand quilter. I wish I had a girlfriend here because she is an award-winning, fabulous hand quilter. I think mostly when it comes to dealing with corners, when I have spoken with her, when a corner that converges and you want to create a motif in that corner, is to try and find a spot where you can kind of overlap and shift to get your design then to converge into the corner. Look at what other people have done. Suggestions from, and there are so many images on the internet anymore that sometimes that inspiration can help us go, oh, that's how those lines ought to come together, maybe overlap, make a design, and then come back out again. Because when we're putting motifs in a border and they converge, it can be kind of daunting to figure out what to do to get everything to look continuous as it goes around the corner. And sometimes that takes a little bit of drawing and trial and error. And usually another friend of mine who actually does long arm quilting, who has similar issues. Sometimes she wants to come up with something special. She will actually lay it out and draw over and over until she decides, okay, those come together nicely, and then uses that as kind of her template for how to mark that portion of the quilt. So look to see what other people have created, because they are our best resource. And then do a little trial and error, draw it out until you find that one that you're comfortable with. Sometimes I'll come up with 3 or 4 ideas of what to quilt in an area, and I'll lay them out and I'll think about them for a day or two. And as I come back to them, my eye will usually jump to the one I like the best. And that one that's most pleasing in design. And that's the one I tend to end up going with. It's just kind of like there's something internally that our brain just says, ooh, I like the way that plays together and goes around the corner. But don't get in a big hurry as a hand quilter, you're probably not in a huge hurry because you do this beautiful, peaceful work that just is elegant and I love and I wish I could do. I just don't know if I have the patience for it, but take the time and follow the lines of what you've created in the straight borders and see how you can converge those to create a lovely corner as it just kind of flows around the corner like a river.
All right, good tips there on that one. A quick hello again to Joanne. We've got a lot of Canadians tuning in today. Joanne is from Mission, British Columbia. So hello to all of our neighbors to the north. I know we're in the Midwest United States, so you're our northern neighbors up there. Let's do Dale's question here next. So Dale is looking for some suggestions for where to learn how to make a crazy quilt where there are no straight lines, all made from scraps. What do you think about something like that?
Crazy quilt blocks are fun to create. And I have seen a lot of pictures recently of what they call crumb quilts, where the pieces are really small. And a lot of times it's starting with a foundation base, whether it's a fabric, just a simple white or unbleached fabric as the base. Sometimes people in the past have used paper or tissue or something as a base. Interfacing can be a base if it's really lightweight. And then starting with a shape and then building out from that in every direction until you get to the outside edges. That's a great way to use up scraps. You may find that they multiply on you because as you pull out fabrics to use up, you fluff them and it seems like they just grow out of the containers that they are drawers that they came from. But crazy quilt blocks are a fun way to use up those small things where you don't have to be as concerned about precision cutting and piecing and everything always fitting together, because there's kind of a freedom to creating those kinds of blocks. And if you look back into the past, there were crazy quilts that today are in museums because they are so awesome. Quilts that were created with clothing fabrics and even things like velvets and satins and taffetas. Over time, some of those fabrics didn't wear as well, but the elegance of those different kinds of substrates, we call them, coming together, and then people would take the time to do embellishments with embroidery along the areas where pieces are joined together, can be absolutely the most fascinating quilts to look at, because your eye just goes from one piece of fabric to the next, and the quilt ends up telling a story. So I would say if you are interested in making crazy quilt blocks, jump in and have some fun.
Okay, let's talk about when the seams go wrong. So Dawn has not had good luck with seam rippers. What is your favorite seam ripper? Where should we be looking for a good seam ripper?
Yes, I and my seam ripper are quite good friends. I remember growing up, I think I must have used a seam ripper more than I did my sewing machine as a kid, because I was a garment sewer and I didn't like to read the instructions. I would just look at the pictures, and then my mom would look over my shoulder and go, mm-mm-mm. So as I was taking something out because I put something together wrong, seam rippers, because we use them quite often, finding one that's comfortable in your hand is important. The little ones that come with our sewing machines, I know the companies mean well, but they give us this little teeny handle to hold on to with a plastic cover, and the seam ripper handle is maybe 1.5 inches long. Well, that's not going to be comfortable in my hand. So for emergency purposes, it's in the drawer and I can find that one, but I tend to go toward the Clover brand seam ripper. It has, when they first came out, it had a round handle. They got smart, and then they made it oval. So now it doesn't roll off of the table. I think that's ingenious. And because that little round one always ended up on the floor. He always rolled away. So that oval handle, something that will stay on the surface so you can find him. This has a grip to it. It's not a super soft rubbery grip, but it's something for your fingers to actually hold on to. And then the actual portion, the metal portion, is a little bit longer than probably about the same, maybe, than those ones that come in the little tiny handle with maybe a clear plastic cover that always cracks. This comes with like a little sleeve that comes over the top. This one does not come with a cover. That would be the only thing I can think of that they could improve on the Clover, is if it had, for when you take it to class, so you don't have this weapon in your bag, something to protect it that would snap over the top. But I like the shape of this one. It's comfortable in my hand. Now, there are all kinds of brands out there. I have used some where this metal shaft portion was very short, and I wondered at the time, it just seemed kind of stubby. And when I went to try and use it, it makes my wrist go at a strange angle. So that was not my favorite brand, made by a set of quilters out there that I just stuck for a little bit longer, so the angle is a little easier on my hand. Seam rippers do get dull over time. So don't think this is going to be the last seam ripper you purchase. The cutting portion is in that U shape of the metal. And over time, because we tend to use them a lot, they get sort of dull and don't cut through the thread as efficiently as we like. And then that's the time to buy a new one. Sometimes we'll just grimace at the thought that they have to buy a tool again, but we replace the rotary blades in our cutters. We replace scissors over time. We even have to replace cutting mats when they wear out, sewing machine needles when they get dull. So just remember that this also is just a tool. It's going to wear out over time. So I have one upstairs that he's well used, and when I pick him up and I go, oh, you're the old guy, you put back in the cupboard just for emergency sake only, and find the newer version, because that being able to easily slip and cut a thread when I'm going to unsew something, because it happens, is important. So something that's comfortable in your hand, something that won't roll off your cutting surface, and is easy for you to find. Now, there are some really gorgeous ones that have fancy handles, wooden handles, painted handles, ceramic ones. I would say, let's find out what other quilters think too. This just happens to be my favorite.
Yes, it's always helpful to know what people really like to use. So if you have a favorite seam ripper and you want to share that with Dawn and everybody else that's viewing, you can drop that into the chat box as well. We'll gather a little bit of information there. I love we're getting some design questions here today. Our next one comes from Tanya. Tanya's creating her own so-called modern quilts, has made shapes that are irregular and now call for negative space between them. So how do I decide on the cut size of the negative space pieces?
It just depends. I guess it depends a little bit, since I can't actually see your project. That negative space, I would always cut larger and then cut down, because it's hard. I mean, you're going to have to put a seam in it if you decide you want it larger. So going big is always kind of the quilter way to go. Go big or go home kind of thought. Having a space that it continues on, you can always trim to the size you want later. But I guess in the overall scheme of thing, it really depends on how the quilt is going to be used. Is it going to be a bed quilt? Do you want that motif or the design that you've created to land just on the top portion of the bed, or do you want it to flow over the sides? Is that design that you've created going to be hung on a wall? And do you want the focus to be mostly those irregular shapes? Do you want it to get lost in the background or just be an accent to the background? So you really need to think about how you're using the quilt and how much negative space you're going to put around that. And sometimes as quilters, we determine that after it's quilted. And then we decide, okay, this is really what I want. And then I can go and cut down some of the actual quilted outer portion of it. So don't be afraid to go there. I know it does waste a little bit of fabric. I'm sure you can find something to use those pieces for, but use and how you want the appearance to speak is really important. So if it's a wall quilt, if it's a table runner, if it's a bed quilt, really lay that quilt out or hang it in that space and see how it speaks. Maybe it needs a little bit more negative space around it so that your eye then goes right to the center. Other times you want that irregular piecing, that design that you've created to be the main piece, and you just want a little negative space to just kind of say, this frames it, and then that's it. So I would hang it up, lay it out, put it in the space where you're going to be using it, and that will help you determine that amount of negative space you put around and outside of that design.
All right. Hopefully that's helpful there. That sounds like an exciting project. I share that definitely with whatever
Yes,
you decide. Please. All right, let's go to Christy from Austin next. So Christy has lots of fabric and wants to prepare the blocks for the future. What sizes are typical? This way I can save space and prepare in advance, she says. So what do you think about Christy?
Okay. Blocks that we work with, because there is math involved, if they are pieced blocks, we typically, I should say, use things that are either divisible by 2 or divisible by 3. So we use, if it's 2 blocks across and 2 up, then the math works for either 2 or 3. But when we get into things that are like a 9 patch, so 3 blocks across and 3 down, we can use 2s and 3s, but depending on what you want your finished project to be, it kind of determines the size that you create your blocks into or cut your pieces into. If you're pre-cutting for blocks or strips, there are a lot of methods out there. Some people like to cut everything into, some people like 5-inch squares. They're what we call a charm square, 5-inch squares, similar to what the pre-cuts are on the market. And there are patterns that use those 5-inch squares. Then there are 10-inch squares. Those are what we would, in some cases, call a charm, or not charm back, but a layer cake. One company calls them that, but pre-cut 10s. And there are patterns that use 10s. Then there are people who like to cut their scraps and pieces into 2.5-inch strips, which are like those pre-cut strips that are out there, again, patterns that are really usable with 2.5-inch strips. So if that's the idea that you're going with, 2.5, 5, and 10 are kind of numbers that there are patterns available, a wide variety of patterns, and a lot of companies use those as pre-cut numbers. Sometimes you're adding a background fabric to that besides those squares, but those are common numbers if that's what you're talking about. If it's coming down to creating blocks themselves and stashing the blocks away, for myself, when I plan a quilt or design a quilt, I like to use blocks that have the same grid. So how do I describe that? If one of our moderators put up a picture from Valiant Stars, you will see there are 3 different blocks in the quilt, but they're all on a 9-patch grid. So the math is similar within the quilt. So when you're making blocks that you want to have a really cohesive look, lay them out in the same grid, kind of gives something a common ground for all the blocks to flow from one to the other. There are also quilts out there that are made with a couple of 15-inch blocks. Some are 12, some are 5. But see, if you've got 15 and 10 and 5, the math kind of is divisible, so you could fill in easily. Other times, if you use a 15 and a 12 and maybe a 6, you're going to have to put fill-in space around that to fit them all together. So I'm not exactly sure if you're creating blocks in advance that you want to go together, but there's always that. As quilters, we are people who love puzzles, and you will find a way to get them to work together.
Okay, let's go to Janine's question next. Janine, if I am interpreting this wrong, you can drop some more specification in, but Janine has a question on cutting borders. Janine is having trouble with cutting the borders for the quilt because the stripes are long. So do you have tips to start out with? And then, like I said, Janine, if you're looking for anything more specific, go ahead and drop that into the chat box.
Okay, so you're probably cutting strips that will fit around the outside of your quilt. And yes, those are long strips. The biggest thing to do is to lay your quilt top out. Make sure you double check your measurements, because patterns will tell you what size your quilt top should finish, but that doesn't mean it always does, because as quilters, we're all unique, and our patchwork can be a little unique also. So you want to get an accurate measure of your quilt top first. And then when it comes to cutting the strips, now depending on if you're cutting them lengthwise or you're cutting them crosswise, I tend to cut most of the borders for my quilts off a crosswise grain. So I'm cutting from fold to selvage. That's probably the most economical way to cut, but sometimes I know there are patterns and designs that we want to go a certain way around our quilt, maybe in a framing kind of thing, and we want to cut lengthwise. And cutting lengthwise is always a little bit more of a challenge. Refolding the fabric and pressing can assist you in that. So if you are taking the fabric, so we're going to have an example here. We're going to say this is the selvage and this is the fold. If you need to open up your fabric and get rid of that fold, that pressed crease in there, so that you can refold your fabric the other direction and cut, that will help also. But laying it out, refolding the fabric, aligning the selvage edges, and then taking those off. Even if you're at all worried that you're going to have just a little bit of a wonky line, overcut them. If you're overcutting by maybe a 1/4 inch, you can trim it later. There's nothing that says that once a border is put on, and then maybe the one edge isn't perfect, put that at the outer edge, that you can't trim that even after it's quilted. There is no quilt police that's going to arrest you for trimming. So if you're at all worried, open them up, see how nice, if you can get them as straight as possible. If you have to go back in and do any trimming, that way if you have a little bit of leeway either direction, you can then get the best cut on lengthwise strips, because I know lengthwise is always a little bit more of a challenge because we don't have rulers that will stretch a long piece. So you're going to have to fold it up and use a longer, maybe a 24.5-inch ruler. If I can get mine into the picture here. That's why having that 24.5-inch ruler, and again, I'm not selling any product. I'm just saying that one of these is going to be your friend because it can go across the width of fabric, but it also, as you refold fabric, the opposite direction and lining up your selvage edges, you can cut a wide width and quite a bit of it at once, and you'll be cutting multiple layers. Now, if cutting multiple layers gives your heart the quiver, cut one layer at a time and cut the width that you need. Maybe, over cutting again though, but using it selvage kind of as a guide so that you can get that first cut lengthwise off of there nice and straight. And then you can go back and trim it to the size you need. But that's one reason why I usually say a 24.5-inch ruler is an investment, yes, but it is really great when it comes to cutting borders, because those small rulers, having to move it all the time, you're going to get a line that kind of weaves back and forth. And this will give you at least a 24.5-inch strip, nice and straight, that then you can repeat that length. So if it's new to cutting borders, do them one layer at a time. If you feel confident in the folding process and getting everything aligned along, say, lining up selvages, then you can cut multiple layers at once. But it really comes up to your comfort zone. I think the very first time I had to cut a lengthwise border, I did single layer because having to replace a lot of fabric is not a fun thing.
Okay, I've got a few more hellos to get to. So we have Andrea joining us from Michigan, and we have another first-time viewer, Helen from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So thank you for saying hi. We love having you with us. I do also want to remind everybody we've crossed over the halfway point of the time we have today. So if you're hanging on to any questions for Colleen, you want to make sure to get those into the chat box, and we will get to all of the ones that we can in the time that we have. That leads us to our next question. We're kind of going to revisit a topic. This one comes from Chris, and Chris is asking, do you find that your seam ripper gets dull? So we kind of talked about that. I was hoping you would elaborate maybe on how long you can expect a seam ripper to last, and also, can you tell if it's just catching or if it's actually dull? How do you know the difference?
The amount of push that you have to give to cut a thread will definitely let you know that it is getting dull. I think that most of my seam rippers I've probably gotten 4 years out of, and I sew a lot because I'm constantly making samples. I mean, I worked for 2 different quilt shops making samples, teaching classes. So they don't dull super fast, but over time, just keep that in the back of your mind. I will have to replace this favorite tool eventually. So, and some people sometimes will actually buy 2 at a time just so that they have a spare ready to go. When it goes dull, it seems like it's a lot of push to get through a thread, and it should just kind of glide through like hot butter. So
all right,
that's the test.
Ooh, I like that. That's a good way to know and feel, just gliding through. Jean's got a question about fabrics next. So Jean wants to know your thoughts, Colleen, on mixing fabric types in a quilt. So for example, a large pieced cotton square with a linen curtain fabric as a border for the quilt. Do you think the different weights will work together?
Weights of fibers can work together. The biggest thing to concern is the fiber content and the washing of that project when it's done. If it's going to need to be laundered, I would double check on the amount of shrink possibly within that fabric and how it will react over time there. I know one of the quilts that my daughter made when she was in a 4-H program years ago, her first quilt, she decided she wanted quilter's cotton, she wanted flannel, and she wanted a chenille fabric. And mind you, that chenille ended up everywhere because it shed like crazy. But because there were 3 different substrates and different thicknesses in there, we really had to do more pinning because of the thickness and trying to keep things aligned, because some fabrics have more stretch than others. So you may need to find you may need to pin in order to get them to play nicely as they go through the machine. If you're going to a heavier weight fabric on the outer edge, it will weight the quilt on that outer edge. It may be that you have to think about the quilting so that you, because recently someone had popped up and they'd had a seam that had pulled apart, and there wasn't any stitching near that seam, and that seam took stress, and that border will cause stress on your quilt. So make sure that if you do use a fabric like that, that you do some quilting to reinforce that seam. By the backing and the batting do give strength, but the actual quilting process is almost like putting the bones in and the structure in that helps hold those layers together so that one won't pull away from the other. So make sure that you do some kind of quilting in that area that crisscrosses that seam, so it gives it a strength there to reinforce it. But number one, double check your fiber content to see how it will react with quilter's cotton first. And then do a little test, sew pieces together on a small sample, see how you like the feel of it. It's going to have, like I said, it's going to have more structure and weight than the center portion of your quilt. So a little test might be in order there.
All right, a few more hellos. First, another first-time viewer, Colleen, is joining us today. And then, so we got Colleen and Colleen.
What a great Irish name.
Exactly. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And then I have to shout out Deborah Norris. All right, she just jumped in. She said she was a little late. She was putting her garden in. So I wanted to jump back since she missed the top of the hour for some fantastic activity. Deborah, I feel you on your garden. I'm about ready for mine too. It's about that time. You had mentioned, Colleen, a little bit of springtime that's going to be showing up in some of the projects. And a little flower that you mentioned. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that. Let us know what's coming up.
Yep. I got inspired. I don't know why. I was looking at fabrics of the day and something had a tulip design in it. And I went out to the mailbox and I noticed the leaves on the tulips are about 3 inches out of the ground. So as a quilter and a gardener who loves flowers, that tulip got stuck in my head and was rolling around. And instead of, doing laundry, I was creating a new quilt idea. So I was searching through patterns for tulip designs, seeing what was already out there, using my Electric Quilt 8 pattern, coming up with an idea. And then once you come up with an idea, of course, then you have to colorize it and plunk in ideas. And then the tool lets you like rotate the blocks to come up with some fun designs with the leaves and everything. So there is a tulip project coming to Facebook Live in the next couple weeks or so.
Yes. Oh, that'll be exciting. So keep an eye out for that. And welcome back in from your garden. We're glad to have you for the last bit of today's Q&A. Let's do Dale's question next here. Now, Dale is using a sheet for the back of my quilt. On a sheet, what is considered the selvage?
On a sheet, it wouldn't be the pieces that would ride along the sides of your bed. Those would be, I guess, considered to be the selvage edge. On a sheet is a little harder because the weave is a little tighter, usually. Check the fiber content also. Sheets can be used as backs. They are not my preferred. My long arm really does not like them because the punch through tends to be, sheets tend to be very highly, tightly woven. And when the needle goes down through, it tends to punch a hole through that. And it doesn't lay as nicely on the back. But I do know that availability of fabrics and cost sometimes leads us to go that direction, to use a sheet on the back, and that's fine. I would consider, though, that the side seam, the seams that run the sides of the bed, not the top and bottom, but the sides, to be sort of the selvage direction of a fabric that is used in bedding. So you may need to, I've had one delivered to me to use as the backing on a quilt, and I had to take out all of the seaming at the header and at the foot in order to have enough yardage there to actually put on the back of, put it onto the long arm. So double check to make sure that you're leaving, if you're taking it to a long armor, that you have enough room around that. Or if you're going to be quilting it and layering it yourself, before you get started, make sure you have, at least 3 inches. A lot of times they say 4 or 5 inches of play on all sides of your quilt with your backing. May need to open up those hems so that you have enough space there. if something happens to shift a little bit, because having to add on fabric is never what a quilter wants to go and stop quilting and go back and add backing fabric. So make sure that you have plenty of perimeter larger than your quilt top.
Okay. Ooh, we're talking seam rippers today. We got lots of comments on seam rippers. We're going to go back. One of our viewers is really enthusiastic and loves table seam rippers. And I'm wondering, Colleen, since we have so many first-time viewers as well, would you talk about what is a table seam ripper? What makes it different from the one that you're showing?
Ooh, okay. The tabletop version, as you said it, I was like, click, click, click. I gotta think of what is. There are tabletop seam rippers. There are ones that actually will hold your seam ripper, but there are some that are designed to sit on a surface. Maybe it's an end table, maybe it's your sewing surface, maybe it's your ironing board. They are usually tend to have a little tiny blade inside that just reveals just a tiny portion of a cutting blade, so that when you are either wanting to trim long thread tails, that you just push down on the top and the thread is cut. Or if you're chain piecing pieces together, which I was actually doing earlier on my tulips, I chain piece from one block to the next until I have like a clothesline of pieces. And there's just a little thread jump between my blocks. I can hold that over a tabletop seam ripper and just push down, and then it just cuts the thread really fast. So some people really enjoy having something like that where they don't have to pick it up. It just sits there and they can just slide through the pieces through and it cuts the thread quickly like that. So the tabletop, I think I've probably seen at least 4 different brands maybe on the market of seam rippers. I actually saw one at a show recently here in Iowa. And at first I didn't know what it was because I was like, I haven't seen that before. And I was kind of inquisitive. And then I realized that there was a little groove in this plastic, and there was a tiny little blade inside of it. So it actually took a rotary cutter blade, I believe, is what was inside of that tool. And then it covered up, it was a round shield of plastic on both sides, and then had a groove down in it where the blade was revealed. So it's fairly safe because you can only kind of get a piece of fabric down in there or thread to cut, so that there's not a lot of blade that's revealed or anything, so it's not sharp that way. And you don't actually have this point to deal with that's on a handheld seam ripper. So if dexterity and having to pick up or hold a tool is something that can be an issue for you, that tabletop one, for those of us who love to chain piece, or even just cutting thread tails off of a block, by easily just holding it and pushing down on that, you can snip those threads and blocks apart really quickly. So there's another tool for you to buy. Welcome to quilting.
All right, before we get to our next few questions, it's time for me to remind you we're getting close to the end of our time. So if you're holding on to a question, this is the time to drop it into the chat box for Colleen. So hopefully we can get to it before we have to say goodbye today. We do have a few in there already, so I'm going to get to those, but drop your extra ones in and we'll get as many as possible in the next 10 minutes or so that we have. So first we've got Kathy. Kathy is wondering, when fabric is slightly stretched, do you eye the cut even though the fabric is not straight, or do you keep cutting until the fabric is straight?
Whenever I begin cutting off of a piece of fabric, I always do a cleanup cut to get it straight. Now, when I define straight, I mean that the selvages are lined up, the fabric lays flat, and it doesn't have a twist at the fold. Now, there are some people who love to have it perfectly on grain and cut and want one thread all the way across and have that perfectly straight. I am not of that thought. It's kind of, there's two mindsets, either perfection to the point where it slows me down, or sometimes close counts. So when I take a long piece of fabric I brought home from the store, I'm aligning those selvage edges up. We'll pretend like this is a folded piece of fabric. Now, if when I get it home, if the selvages, if these two, where the binding here at the top edge, if they aren't lined up one on top of the other, I realign them till they're one on top of the other. I don't want to have this happen. I don't want to have this twisting effect at the bottom. I want to hold those selvage edges until this falls nice and straight into a line. Then I'm putting that on my cutting mat, and I'm going to make a cleanup cut here, knowing now that from here, from the fold to my line is going to be perpendicular. So I have a straight cut at the beginning, and that's what I use to judge my next cut on. I am not one to overly worry whether or not I'm perfectly on grain or not. We are going to cut this fabric into a zillion little pieces and put it all back together. That's the insanity that my husband affirms every time. You are going to cut that up and put it back together. So whether or not it's perfectly on grain is not so important in the quilt world as in garment sewing. Because I remember the days of garment sewing when if you cut something off grain, your skirt twirled around you, the pant leg twirled around you, and it was so uncomfortable, you never wanted to wear that garment again. So in the quilt world, we're cutting it into such small pieces and then reassembling it that perfect grain is not as vital as in the garment industry or garment sewing world. So as long as you can get those selvage edges aligned, the fold lays flat, make that cleanup cut so that there is a perfect 90-degree angle here. You want that to be perfectly aligned as best you can. And then I realign my fabric, and I always cut with, for some reason, maybe it's the instructor I had when I first started quilting, but I always have the fold along right in front of me and then push out in a way. Excuse me, out in a way to cut the strips of blocks off of my yardage of fabric. So there are times when we're using a stripe or a printed floral that we want things to be fairly straight. I got lucky on this project. There is a tiny stripe in here that it was fairly straight to start out with, so that it wasn't skewed from the sizing or the spray starch in the fabric. But there are times when even if that occurs, I think it adds interest to the quilt. I know if my mom is watching, her eyes are rolling back because whenever I use a plaid, my plaids are always kind of all over the place. But that's, to me, is what the charm of quilting is all about. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, quilts hang in museums because they aren't perfect. So be that quilter. Don't worry so much about it being perfect. Have a little fun. If it's going to drive you crazy, maybe pick a different fabric altogether. Maybe stripes and plaids aren't your thing. Go for something that has more of a scatter print, something that's an overall design until you feel comfortable like letting a stripe or a plaid be just a little bit wonky. So enjoy the process. That's the idea. That's what quilting is all about.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions, but before we get to them, Ginger has a really good one. Ginger wants to know when we'll be doing another chat so that Ginger can write down any questions that come up for next time. So Ginger and everybody that is viewing, we do these about once a month. So you can keep an eye out for when the next one will be up and live, and hang on to your questions for the next one. But we do not do these and then forget about them. About once a month, we've got Colleen with us answering these questions. So please come back for the next one and hang on to the questions you have in the meantime so that you can ask them then. Great question, Ginger. I'm glad you gave us a chance to talk about that. Let's get to our last 2 questions. I'm going to kind of combo about the sheets. We have 2 viewers that had some ideas about the sheet topic that we were just on. So Judy was mentioning maybe buying a flat sheet 1 size up will give you some space to work with. And then Angela had an idea about a duvet using a sheet backing, and also wanted to know if sheets would be better used for a backing on tied quilts.
They can be. I would check the fiber content on those because sometimes we get looser weaves. Number one, there are sheets that are a sateen weave. They feel great to sleep under, but they're a looser weave and they're a little less durable for like the back of a quilt. If they have a polyester content to them, they could pill over time, and there can be issues where backing or batting tends to kind of work its way through that backing fabric. So it's quilter's choice. Again, like I said, if cost is an issue, of availability of fabric is an issue, and it's going to stop you from quilting, use the sheet. I'm good with whatever keeps you quilting and keeps you producing artwork that you get to express yourself. You're making maybe things for other people, making things for family. That's an expression of love. And so quilting is good in any form. At any point, though, if you have access to 108 wide, extra wide quilt backing, you may find cost-wise that it doesn't cost much different than a sheet nowadays, because sheets can be kind of pricey. Mm-hmm. So you can check online. For a lot of shops anymore have developed websites because of COVID, so that all their products are online. And the 108 wide fabric, if you're making a large quilt, and sometimes you can find it on sale. Sometimes long armors have access to 108 wide or extra wide backing for quilts too. So, the sheet might not be the only avenue to explore. Look and see if that 108 wide is available near you, and see what the cost is. You might be surprised.
All right. We have had a couple last minute questions drop in. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them today, but we're going to try as many as possible. Deneen's question is next. Deneen wants to know, what is the best fabric to use for quilting?
The best you can afford. That's the hard part. When we're beginning quilting and maybe budgets are tight, use what you can afford. As you get better with your patchwork and your cutting and your designs, if you can afford better quality fabric, move up to the quilt shop level. There is a difference. When I first started, I didn't really notice. I didn't know there was a big difference, because I was coming to quilting from kind of a garment background. And so I was more looking at garment fabric when I was in shops and not looking at quilting fabrics. Well, then I realized that, yes, there's fabric in big box stores and chains, and they come in a variety of colors, and they come in different qualities though too. Even there, what we call the gray goods, the base fabric that quilters use, that things are printed onto, come in different grades. So sometimes you will pick up a fabric that's very, very starchy and very stiff, and when you hold it up to the light, you can see pin dots of light coming through. Those are loose weave. They have a lot of inks on them. They have a lot of starch in them that may loosen up over time and not be as strong as the fabrics you will find in an actual quilt shop. So investigate the differences. I know the price can be kind of dicey back and forth, because I think fabric is at least at $12 a yard now in the United States. And it might be more than that for batik fabrics. And in other places, it may be well beyond that price. So whenever you're planning a quilt, depending on how it's going to be used, who you're giving it to, and what you can afford, do the best you can. That's what it comes down to. Eventually, you can get to the quilt shop fabric, but when you're beginning and your budget's tight, do what you can with what you have.
All right. Well, with that answer, we have hit the top of the hour. So that means that for now, we have to say goodbye. If we didn't get to your question today, please, please, please come back for the next Q&A. It will be next month sometime. Again, like I said, we do these about once a month. So we will be back with Colleen to answer more questions in the future. But before we say goodbye, Colleen, I want to give you the floor for one more moment, just again to remind us where we can find you, maybe showcase that shamrock star placement pattern that you have in front of you one last time, and then I have a few reminders to see us off. But first, Colleen.
Okay. Shamrock Star placemat is that free pattern that you can get. You can either find it probably at Crafts here, National Quilters Circle. Look in there, you'll be able to find probably the video also attaches with it. So if you're new to quilting and want some tips and tricks on how to put it together, there's a video attached, or you can find the video that goes with the pattern. I do those twice a month on Facebook Live. So there are a lot of projects, little projects that we do every other week on Facebook Live. There are You can follow me on Facebook on account by my name. You can follow me on Instagram the same way. There are so many wonderful projects. There's even an Earth Day project coming out in April. So stay tuned.
All right, and another place that you can find that pattern is in the chat box. So just scroll through the chat box. Our team has dropped that link in for you for the free download for Colleen's pattern. As far as today goes, we're saying goodbye, but like we said, come back and see us another time. This is the National Quilters Circle Q&A. I have to say thank you to Colleen for all of your wonderful expertise in guiding us through quilting projects. To everybody that joined us today, thank you for joining. Come back the next time. We love to have these chats with you. And until we see you the next time, my name is Leah. Thank you for joining us and have a fantastic day.